Welcome to today's webinar on CDPs and DMPs, key differences, benefits, and how they coexist. I'm Megan Winnery, Senior Demand Gen Manager at Helium, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar will last approximately 45 minutes and will be recorded, and the slides in the recording will be made available at the end of the session. You'll find some related resources in the attachment section that you can view during or after the webinar, so check them out. And we want to hear your questions, so please use the Ask a Question feature to submit them. And for any that we aren't able to answer live, we'll follow up with you after. And you'll see the social hashtag for today's webinar in the lower right-hand corner of our deck, hashtag Helium CDP and DMP webinar. We encourage you to retweet, like, and share as we live tweet throughout the webinar. And on to today's presenters. Chris Morgan is a Senior Solutions Consultant at Helium and has experience that spans digital media buying, both as a practitioner and manager, as well as consulting on various MarTech and AdTech platforms. Chris comes to Helium by way of the Oracle Marketing Cloud, where he focused his attention on integrating various OMC products with Oracle DMP BlueTime. Dan is a Solutions Consulting Manager at Helium and has been with the company for nearly 7 years. His product expertise and customer success skills have allowed him to lead the launch and support of Helium products, Helium IQ, Audience Stream, Data Access, and more. For the last 2.5 years, he has managed the Solutions Consulting Operations team, focusing on product knowledge, team knowledge sharing, product viability, industry intel, GDPR, and more. Okay, and now for today's agenda. During today's webinar, we'll be discussing how to power a more successful MarTech stack with CDPs and DMPs, the purposes of each and how both work. We'll then briefly discuss why there's so much hype about CDPs, how these CDPs and DMPs differ from each other, and how they coexist. Okay, let's get this presentation started. Chris and Dan, over to you.
Cool. Thank you, Megan. So this is Chris Morgan here, and I just want to start off by saying that really the intention of this webinar is to give an unbiased and unnuanced discussion of the customer data platform and DMP categories, which is based on our experience and research within both technologies. So again, this is a general view of CDPs and DMPs, not one CDP versus another CDP or one CDP versus a DMP. These are generalities. I also want to call out that my first love of a MarTech technology was of a DMP, so I hold them and their place in the industry in a very high regard. And today, Dan and I hope to introduce some of the concepts as to why CDPs and DMPs are different and how organizations should think about leveraging one or both to satisfy their business requirements. So getting into the content, when evaluating a CDP or a DMP, what are companies trying to solve for? So one is putting the customer at the center. This is called an initiative or a mandate, but essentially what they want is a technology that will enable them to put their customer first, understanding their behavior, and providing the right experience at the right time. Now, in order to do this, the tech needs to collect, organize, and manage all of the data their customers are creating. And this will enable cross-channel activation to meet the customer wherever they are, providing the right experience at the right time, whether on the digital property or out in the ecosystem.
Yes, thank you. So the next piece of this is we want to jump into the purpose of each, how they work. We can talk about some of the key differences. But let's start off with what the purpose is of each of these. And this is understanding the foundational purpose of what's going to help set the two apart. So let's talk about CDPs. From their perspective, CDPs were created to be one centralized system that receives incoming data from multiple tools and data sources within an organization's MarTech stack. And so you're probably asking, what are some of these tools or data sources? You can think of the most common ones, which are a website, a mobile application. You get into some of the other nuanced systems that we have, like email service providers, or maybe your own backend system where you're controlling some of your customer data. So, but basically anything that has an internet connection, even a refrigerator at somebody's house, can, as long as this system or product or tool can export data and get it into the CDP, the CDP should be able to ingest that information. And because of that, ingestion flexibility, that means the CDP has identifiers from all those different systems to build a unified visitor profile. So this is important for several reasons. I think the most common one being that marketers can then use this combined data profile to drive one-to-one personalized experiences that consumers are expecting. And that means you can get this across web, email, mobile apps, really the entire ecosystem. So these tools need to be fueled by the data that's held within the CDP.
Cool, thanks, Dan. So what is the purpose of the DMP and why were they built? So essentially it's to understand digital behavior of customers across all digital touchpoints, and then use third-party data to better know who, from a demographic, psychographic, economic, etc., data points that they might not know about their customers from a first-party standpoint, meaning they're not volunteering this data, use those learnings to intelligently acquire new potential customers. And one of the prominent ways that DMPs do this is through lookalike models. So identifying who are the top segments of your customers based on revenue or whatever that might be, engagement, and then build lookalike models, so identifying another segment of the population of people that look like them and would have the highest propensity to become your customer. So this is primarily done through top-of-funnel acquisition through the display channel.
Excellent, thanks. So now that we understand the purpose of each, let's get into the conversation about how they actually work. So understanding the differences here will shed some light on the differences on each system. So let's start with the CDP. So there's a good bit of information here. So let's talk about, again, the core purpose of a CDP is to connect customer data from all those different touch points, and which you can tell primarily revolves around visitor behavior data. It generally isn't going to include psychographic data, or it can include demographic data, but it's not really that often that it would. And so this data is typically, right now, being stored in a silo without a CDP or even a DMP, which makes it difficult for companies to provide that consistent customer experience across all those different channels and customer devices. The CDP aggregates all of this data into that single view of the customer, which is really known as a visitor profile, and is built up, that visitor profile is then built up with visitor attributes and segments to which they belong to. So since these visitor profiles are based on a specific customer, an important piece then is a CDP should be able to leverage all known identifiers from all data sources for identification. So that means it needs to be flexible, the CDP, with its resolution tools, its resolution techniques, and not really pin your brand into using a specific technique or yet creating another identifier that must be synced between all the vendors in your marketing ecosystem. So having access to all those known identifiers and building dynamic and custom segments within the CDP then allow the marketers to sync segments with the brands, with your brand's already existing marketing tools for cross-channel orchestration. And so I want to be clear that the CDP is not doing that cross-channel orchestration. It's just the purpose is to get data to those downstream vendors. The CDP is just providing that stack with the data of from the single view of the customer. And so these unified profiles are much better for marketing at that point because they expand that entire ecosystem. It's the information is coming from the same data set. Additionally, from an analysis perspective, your data scientists aren't trying to merge data from all those different silos and do a whole bunch of processing to get that data into a single profile. You already have most of that coming from the CDP, which is going to have that single view of the customer. Which makes it much easier, usually makes them happier from what we've seen in the field. So, but lastly, since the CDP is storing visitor level information, there should be the option to store data. We typically say at least the average length between the visits that a customer sees, but possibly indefinitely. And I think that's important because you want to persist that knowledge you've gained about the customer, such as the lifetime affinities and the actions you've taken about your visitors.
So let's give a high level of how DMPs work. And so typically DMPs are going to have third-party data marketplaces natively within their platform that their customers can use to build targeted segments, primarily used for acquisition, so driving people to the digital property and getting them into the funnel. Now, the other option is that you have the ability to blend your first-party data. So again, first-party data would be data that people are creating on your owned and operated digital properties, and so you can blend that behavioral first-party data with third-party data for better insights, and again, to build things like lookalike modeling, or just use those insights to have highly targeted creative based on some demographic information that you're gleaning from the third-party data. And then you can create these segments, and you can syndicate them down to downstream activation tools, primarily demand-side platforms or DSPs. DMPs are reliant on third-party cookies, and this is going to become a theme that you're going to start hearing through the rest of the presentation, but they're really reliant on their third-party cookies that they manage natively within their platform to do all of their tracking as well as identity resolution. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting with the DMP, is that they're only really going to be able to ingest data that they can associate with the third-party identifier in their platform. So for example, and I think this is the best example, is if someone wanted to upload a CRM file directly into the DMP and they wanted to match that email address to the DMP's ID, the only way you would be able to do that is if you've been able to previously match the email address to the DMP's ID. And this is typically done with a login event on the website. So I'm logging into my account, or I'm purchasing something, I submit my email address. At that point, the DMP would be able to sync the email address with the DMP's ID. And then at that point, if I upload a CRM file, that individual record would be able to make it in. However, typically what you see with uploading a CRM file or an offline file of any kind into a DMP is that the match rate is going to be relatively low. And this is why onboarders such as LiveRamp or DataLogic's OnRamp and a handful of others are really synonymous with DMPs. And it's because they help to increase the match rate of bringing this offline data into a DMP, which is just really fundamentally different than a CDP. So really, DMPs are only bringing data in that they can activate against. And with the DMP, their identifiers are temporal in nature because they're cookies. And typically, we see DMPs storing these IDs for less than 180 days. I've seen more. I've also seen less. I think it's also based on relevance of the cookies. But 180 days is pretty standard. Now, one thing to point out is if that cookie is refreshed at any point within that 180-day period, then the 180-day marker will refresh as well. So,
and how does that refresh occur?
So that refresh would occur by you visiting the domain that that cookie is set on. Okay. So getting into CDPs and why all the buzz. So, I've been at Telium for a year and a half now, and there's quite a bit of buzz around the CDP. And it's really at an all-time high in general around the industry. I think a lot of people probably hadn't heard the term CDP until 2018. And an interesting stat that I came across recently is that inquiries from Gartner clients on the topic of CDPs actually doubled between the first half of 2017 and the first half of 2018, and I really don't see that slowing down anytime soon. So let's level set on what a DMP was designed to do and really do very well. So the first thing is understanding digital behavior across the internet. So this is everywhere that the DMP has a lens into, every digital property that has a DMP tag on it. They want to be able to understand someone's behavior from one domain to the next domain to the next domain, and essentially aggregate all of that behavior into a centralized taxonomy that a customer can use to build segments, model, and eventually activate against. Now, by their nature, they're designed to communicate with other technologies that utilize third-party cookies. The best example of this would be demand-side platforms or DSPs. The way that they are able to communicate with these DSPs is that they have to sync their IDs. And so this is where you start to get into the match rates between DMPs and DSPs. But the one thing I want to call out here is there's a lot of ID syncing talk around the industry, and there's a lot of piggybacking. Well, that's primarily how DMPs and DSPs are able to sync their IDs with one another, so that when I create a segment in a DMP, I can then pass it to the DSP, and a good portion of that segment will make it into the DSP for targeting.
So you're saying that piggybacking isn't necessarily a bad thing. It could be a good thing for display.
Well, I would say it's more of a necessary thing for the ad tech ecosystem to be able to communicate and share data back and forth with one another.
Right. Very good.
So following Marketing Cloud acquisitions, DMPs really took on the role as integrators and as such identity resolution tools. However, since DMPs can only really manage third-party cookies, true quote-unquote identity resolution can really not be accomplished. And this is something that you're going to touch on, Dan, but true identity resolution really requires the management of multiple IDs to resolve identity across domains, browsers, and devices. And to do that, you need to be able to append all the identifiers that are being created or submitted by the end user to a central profile so that you can efficiently merge it with other profiles that are being created from different devices and browsers. So subsequently, because you cannot manage other identifiers within the DMP, activation with all tools and all channels cannot be done efficiently. And I say efficiently because it doesn't mean that it can't be done. It just can't typically be done with a really high match rate or be done in real time or other nuances about it that I'm not necessarily going to focus on in this presentation.
Right, so then that's where the CDP has really come into play, is trying to fill some of those voids with what the CDP's core focus was built upon in the first place. So, so we entered the CDP, and there should be some expectations that when you're looking at a CDP, that it should be able to meet. And so, as Chris is saying, and we're going to keep saying it through this through the webinar, is true identity resolution. And so the CDP needs to be able to manage multiple identifiers and merge them or unify them into a single profile. And this means using identifiers that you already know about your customer. We're trying to stay away from creating new identifiers because that means every system then has to be made known with that new identifier. And as Chris was saying, that matching, that refreshing becomes a problem. And so if you already use identifiers that are known about a visitor, it just makes that process much simpler. And so, and then the next piece is the ability to ingest data from any customer data source. And so I mentioned this earlier, it could be from a web property, from a mobile app, an email service provider. So if you're trying to track open rates and get that information into the CDP, anything that regards information about your customers and getting that into a data platform, that you should have, the CDP should have the flexibility to accept that data. And so the next point then is activation to all tools and channels. This is a really important one because you're going to have all those first-party identifiers, and additionally, and don't think that this is just first-party identifiers. The CDP can sync with some of those DSPs to get those third-party identifiers. You're just likely not going to use them to merge profiles together. You're instead going to be using those first-party identifiers. But activation across all tools and channels is important because, as we mentioned earlier, it's the single data set that can be used for activation across your entire ecosystem. And then lastly is, with the rise of global privacy regulations, that having that single view of the customer and storing that single view is of great importance for managing a lot of those tracking preferences. And this more or less refers to GDPR's disclosure, erasure, and portability of the visitor data. So now that we understand the purpose of a CDP and DMP, how they work, and what's all the buzz around the CDP, let's talk about some key differences. And this will bounce back and forth between Chris and I here and talk about some of the major topics and how they really differ at a deeper level. So Chris, let's talk about this again, the key difference from a DMP from a CDP.
Sure. Yeah, and the key difference, and this has been said numerous times, is really identity is anonymous in nature because the third-party identifiers that the DMP stored are anonymous.
Right, which is contradictory to a CDP, which mainly uses known identifiers. So I do want to be clear that a CDP can and typically will do anonymous tracking, and they'll just hold a visitor profile of that visitor until they make themselves known. And once they make themselves known, that's where the power of the CDP can come into play. So until they're known, using those third-party identifiers from those DSPs or DMPs can still be used, but that making themselves known is of greatest importance for leveraging a CDP.
Nice. So visitor matching, DMPs, and especially when you go cross-device, they're heavily reliant on probabilistic identifiers. So this is, with a high probability, this device is associated to this individual, and so is this device. So we're going to merge them to one profile.
Right, which is, from a CDP perspective, it's deterministic. So we know that this person is Dan because they've logged into the website, or they signed up for a newsletter, or they opened up an email that you sent to them. So these are very deterministic. And so, but I do want to make known that, as I just mentioned, that if I open up an email, that's making information known to your digital property. And so my point being that these known identifiers must be explicitly fed to a CDP. They're not just going to be magically found. So from a landing URL, if it's a data layer declaration as part of your website, if it's an offline feed of data, any way that you can make those known identifiers available, the CDP isn't just going to magically find them. It has to be made known.
ID management. So really limited to the storage of the third-party identifiers natively in the platform. Doesn't mean that it can't link out to other identifiers that might also be associated to another identifier, but natively within the platform, they're limited to their third-party identifiers.
Right, so it says the CDP is leveraging first-party data. The important piece is, since we have that single view of the customer, those identifiers must persist with that visitor for all future events. So that way, if they open up an email and go to the website, when they capture the email address there, but then they log in with their credentials on a mobile app, those identifiers need to persist with the visitor profile so we can then merge all that information together later.
Data ingestion, another topic already covered, but it's important to note that DMPs are absolutely capable of ingesting both offline and digital data. However, as I've already covered, it really requires prior matching to a DMP's third-party identifier in order to ingest it into their platform.
Right, and a CDP should have multiple ways to get data into that platform. One of the most common ways is via tag placed on a website. Another common method should be an API. So if you have a system that's not really offline, but it has the ability to make an API call out, that's going to be important, as well as a batch process of bringing data in. So leveraging all those known identifiers, a CDP can then merge all those data across all those different touch points.
Data enrichment. So data enrichment with the DMP is really looking at your first-party behavioral data, so how people are engaging with your digital property, what pages are they looking at, and then blending that data with third-party data and third-party insights so that you have a better understanding of who these people are from a demographic, psychographic, etc. standpoint. Again, data that they're not giving to you, but the DMP is able to augment your first-party data with these third-party data insights, therefore enriching the data.
I think blending is the key word to focus on there. Is from a CDP perspective, it's not so much blending as in building additional knowledge based off of site behavior that a customer has taken when they interact with your brand. So a CDP is going to take all the data it receives, and it can build all those additional insights off of the data for example, to build affinities. So the correlation of data from all those different touch points gives you improved significance of measurement on your visitors to gather important details such as your lifetime order value, or whether or not this person is a VIP, whether or not they're a coupon abuser. So because you're getting information across all those different touch points, the CDP can allow you to determine and build all those additional attributes on top of the data you already have.
Nice. Data activation. So this would be the syndication of segments or audiences or data really in general to another system. DMPs primarily distribute data to other ad tech-based platforms that are reliant on third-party identifiers that they're able to sync with and thus pass segments with a high match rate.
Right, and so from a CDP perspective, with managing all those first-party identifiers, and again, with doing some cookie syncing with a lot of those DSPs, the CDP's collection capabilities make it a prime solution for cross-channel activation. So we can even take some of the data that a CDP has and send it across to a DMP or a DSP. So they're really working together. They're not competing with each other. So having a CDP integrate with all those channels using their well-documented APIs is a key point for activation with the CDP.
Privacy, this could very easily be its own topic. We kind of have it as sub-bullets here, but just to address it, DMPs are really hindered by many of the recent privacy regulations. And there's a few that are going around. Of course, there's GDPR, which requires explicit tracking consent, website by website by website. This is something that will affect not only DMPs, but CDPs. So if you opt out of tracking for either a CDP and or a CDP, then neither are going to get the information. But then you also have things like the e-privacy regulation, where tracking consent is going to be managed by the browsers at essentially a global level or a universal level, as opposed to by the individual websites. So if I opt out of third-party tracking at my browser level, then I'm not going to accept any third-party cookies, whereby not being able to be found by any platform that manages third-party identifiers, right? And then, of course, you have things like Apple's intelligent tracking prevention, which is clearing third-party cookies after 24 hours if they have not been refreshed. So there's a lot of things happening in the industry that is not great for third-party IDs, and so people are finding very creative and intelligent ways to figure out how to circumvent this.
Right, so that's where a CDP can really start to shine, is because of that single view of the customer that you have. You have that visitor profile with a rich plethora of attributes and information about that customer. That's where a CDP can start helping with the GDPR and what California will soon be implementing with disclosure, erasure, portability of data to make it much more clear about what information a brand has on their visitors.
Good stuff. So CDP and DMP, a complementary duo. We agree. So it's not an either or. Really, it's both. And it really depends on what your business requirements are and what you're looking to solve. It could be a DMP, it could be a CDP, or it could be both, and they work better together. So all those scenarios, I think, are very valid. It just depends on what you as a company are evaluating. So our take on CDPs and DMPs is, if you are going to look at utilizing both of them, really, due to the nature of the data ingestion and ID resolution that we've discussed, CDPs are better qualified to be your single source of truth as it pertains to your customer data, because they will accept and ingest all of the data that you're feeding into it and do the best job it can to unify it to a single profile. Now, the data should also be analyzed and modeled in the CDP for a true understanding of behavior across all touch points. This is both in the store, call center, on the website, in the mobile app, and anywhere else that a customer might be creating data. The CDP will be able to bring it in, model it, and understand real-time insights about that individual. And then CDP should be the point of customer data orchestration to all tools, including the DMP, but not exclusive to. This includes your big data ecosystem, whether you're hosting data in the cloud. This includes your ESP, your analytic tool, social, etc. All downstream tools can be fueled by the CDP and that real-time orchestration, or that orchestration of data that they can accommodate. Specific to the DMP, I think utilizing the granular insights that the CDP can feed it will only create better lookalike audiences, because the insights of the data is better, which will improve engagement and ultimately ROI throughout your marketing stack. You know, and one thing that we like to say is that DMPs are really, really fantastic at acquiring new customers and keeping people engaged and getting people into the top of the funnel, bringing people to your digital properties. And once people do raise their hand and engage with you, the CDP can turn those anonymous individuals into known people, anchor them in the platform, and then build an ongoing profile about that individual, which will influence everything else that you do.
So I just want to chime in here and just reiterate is what you're saying is a DMP can get someone into a website and turn them into known visitors. And so when they're a known visitor, that's where the CDP comes into shine. And so just reminding everyone that that's why it's not an either-or approach. It's potentially both based on what your brand needs are.
All right, so let's bring it home. So a quick recap of some of the items that we discussed today. So data ingestion. CDPs and DMPs exist for fundamentally different purposes. Identity resolution is just managed differently within each platform, right? And customer data orchestration, because of the ID limitations within the DMP, they're really limited into the types of channels that they can efficiently communicate with, whereas the CDP can ingest and persist all identifiers to an individual and therefore communicate to that individual or make that profile portable to any downstream system, therefore communicate with all channels. And then finally, the privacy and regulations around GDPR and the e-privacy regulation, the new California laws that are coming out, they're just handling them in fundamentally different ways, and in many ways helping to fuel all the buzz around the CDP. So I think that pretty much wraps up our piece of the presentation.
All right, thanks Chris and Dan. Before we get to questions, just wanted to remind you that there are additional resources provided in the attachment section as well as on Telium.com, so be sure to check them out. All right, over to the questions. So if you please submit your questions with the questions, ask the questions feature, and we'll get to as many as we can. All right, so first question is, how long does a CDP store data for typically?
So I think every CDP vendor that you integrate with is going to be a little bit different. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to want to look at your average length of time between visits and at least use that amount. But it's an important piece to discuss. From a Telium perspective, we've had clients that deal with the eyeglass industry, and their customers are only coming back to their website every 1 or 2 years. And then we have brands where their customers are coming almost every single day. So it depends on the type of brand you have. It determines what you need. So with Telium, you can purchase infinite storage and anything beyond that or before that as well.
Great. All right, next question. This is an interesting one. How is Amazon using CDM, etc., to achieve strategic execution and cause successful disruption with their acquisition of Whole Foods?
It's a good question. So I'm going to take CDM as a customer data management platform. And I think the best way to approach that question is understanding what Amazon does. And this is something that I don't work directly with Amazon, so this is an assumption. But we all know that what Amazon does really well at is data collection, and personalization, right? And Amazon.com does a really great job of servicing the right products to you at the right time to influence a buying behavior. And they're driving a lot of revenue doing that. And so by their purchase of something offline like Whole Foods, if they're able to apply a similar personalized shopping experience in the store, which may or may not be guided by the app with beacons or some other sort of digital touch points within the store shopping experience itself, I think that could potentially be very, very disruptive and not something that is being done, at least at scale, by other large retail companies, grocery and sort of.
All right, lots of great questions flowing in. Okay, if your CDP incorporates identity resolution, why do you need a DMP? Can you just feed your targets directly to a DSP or social media platform like Facebook?
That's a good question, and the answer to that is yes. Your CDP can absolutely do your identity resolution strategy, and it can feed your targets directly to a DSP or a social media platform, both of which have third-party data insights natively within them where you can do lookalike modeling and modeling in general there. Now, I think from a media buying standpoint, there is a need for a DMP if you're activating across multiple DSPs, as an example, because you have a centralized place where you're doing your modeling and all that stuff, blending your third-party data, and then essentially just using your DSP for the activation standpoint. But I think you make a good point in that if you're already using a DSP and you're already using Facebook as a social channel, as an example, you may not have a need for a DMP, but that is something that you as a business would need to assess, and it's certainly not the rule, right?
Great. All right, next question. What is the difference between a CDP and a data lake?
Sure. So the difference between a CDP and data lake, so the CDP is more about activation against your visitor profiles that you have. So yes, the data lake could possibly receive information from a bunch of different resources, but the CDP is meant to act against your visitors in real time. So as they're integrating, as they're experiencing your brand, the ability to take that information and then activate it. So, and you can also, a lot of customers from a Tilium perspective, take the data that we've gathered from our CDP and then ingest it into their data lake. And that data lake is taking data across not just their customer experience, but organizational information that is not exactly customer specific to help build more insights onto the solution. So the CDP is very much customer centric and for activation, whereas the data lake is in the entire business. Right.
Great, thanks, Dan. Okay, next question. From the presentation, it sounds like DMPs are useful for anonymous users and CDPs for known users. Does the CDP offer value for anonymous cookie-based users?
Yeah, so I'll answer this from like a Tilium standpoint, since that's how it's being asked. So we don't necessarily have the concept of an anonymous visitor within our platform, and the reason is because we start to create a profile as soon as there is digital engagement. So we do use cookies. In order to track behavior, specifically when someone is in an anonymous state. However, once they submit an email address, they create an account, they buy something, we will then anchor that profile within our platform to that known identifier and then associate all the data from all the other devices that we're able to associate with that individual to that one profile that has the email address. Now, if we never get an email address, then we will just continue to build a profile in an anonymous state and associate the identifiers that we can glean. Maybe these are other first-party identifiers or other identifiers that we get in cookie syncs, whatever that is, to this quote-unquote anonymous profile. But within our platform, it is just a profile with all the data that we can associate to that profile associated to it.
Thanks, Chris. We've got a ton of great questions. It looks like we have time for one or two more. For any that we aren't able to get to live, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the webinar is over. All right, what's the difference between a CDP and a CIAM?
Yeah, so a customer identity and access management tool is more about getting customers into your website and helping them make it easier to identify who those visitors are. So I think that the main three things that an identity access and management tool will do is let your customers into your website. This could even be with something like single sign-on, and help you recognize them as they come in and out and are logged in or logged out of your website. And the great thing then about a CIAM is that when they recognize that visitor, that data can then be fed to the CDP. So it would just be another source of data that the CDP can ingest and then activate against that customer across the marketing channel.
Great, thanks, Dan. All right, next question. Could you talk more about how a CDP could ingest offline data?
Sure, I'd love to. So I will talk about how a CDP can ingest offline data, and really, when you say offline data, I think you're referring to an export of data, and then you have that in a file format, typically a CSV, and then you're going to upload that into the platform. So your CDP should be able to accept an offline file in that format. Now, the fundamental difference of how a CDP and a DMP are going to ingest that file is, as I mentioned, with the DMP, it needs to have been the record has to have been previously matched to the DMP's third-party ID in order for it to be ingested in the platform, which results in a low match rate. The difference between how a CDP would do it is we would take that file and we would go line by line by line by line by line by line through that file, injecting it into our platform, and we will either append the data associated to each one of those records to an existing profile within our platform or within the platform. Right. And if we do not have an existing profile within our platform that matches an individual record for that file which we are ingesting, we would create a net new profile within our platform and append the data associated to that file to this profile, right? So there isn't a match rate with the CDP, or there shouldn't be a match rate with the CDP. All that data should just come in and either go to a profile or create a new profile, which is ready for immediate analysis and or activation that can accept the identifiers that you're bringing into the platform.
And add on to that one as well as an offline system, yes, typically is going to export data. Depending on the personnel that you have at your disposal within your company, it's possible that because of API integrations of getting data into the CDP, they will instead take that file and write a Python or Perl, some sort of server script that can process that data row by row, and for example, hash the email address before you're sending into the CDP. And then, because that way, if you want to leverage this information in an ESP later, you would have the hash identifier uploaded directly to the ESP, and they can do lookup within there. So as long as there's flexibility with getting data into the system, that's the key point of the CDP.
Great. Well, thank you both. It looks like we've run out of time. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us on the call today, and thank you, Chris and Dan. Have a great day.
Thank you.